Hey, good morning, everybody. Let's talk about grip pressures for a little bit. There seems to be kind of two, I don't want to say two camps, but two trains of thought regarding trigger control and being able to, of course, loosely grip the gun or loosely hold the gun and be able to then control the trigger or control the amount of pressure we exert on the trigger to make the gun fire and being able to hold our accuracy, of course, to a very exceptional level. And that is true. The trigger control is important. However, I am more from the belief on the other side of the spectrum that grip pressure is way more important than the overall level of trigger control that we can apply to the gun, right? Because our level of trigger control is always going to change depending on shot difficulty, target placement, target presentation and target difficulty. We don't always get to think about or get to control the amount of pressure that we put on the trigger, especially when we start firing the gun faster. And what I mean by faster is like in practical shooting, right? We end up, if I was to ask somebody in practical shooting, like, hey, what was the amount of trigger control that you exerted on that 25-yard target or that 30-yard piece of steel? Most guys can't give me a very solid answer on that. They're just like, I don't know. I held the sights still, I guess, and just started to press the trigger. And it's like, precisely, right? So the trigger control thing, if we start to think about just trigger control in and of itself, we end up having to slow our firing cycle way down, and we end up having to almost overthink too much of it, right? We end up pressing the trigger, and I've got an empty Beretta here with a double action, right? We end up pressing the trigger in order to control the amount of pressure that we're putting on the trigger to keep the sights from moving. We end up just kind of gripping the gun, and then support hands just kind of floating there, kind of along for the ride a lot of times. And I see this a lot where people are like, oh, that's my support hand, it's just on the gun. But they don't realize that this is the support hand. Its job is to grip the gun hard and solidly to keep the muzzle, or more importantly, the sights from moving all the way through the press of the trigger, right? So as I press the trigger very slow, I want a very nice, controlled, slow press. I end up then having to, like, I'm gripping the gun, right? But I have to slow the pressures down and almost stage the trigger to keep the sights from steering left or right, up, down, as I'm trying to complete the shot. The problem with that is the moment that we're tasked with, okay, we need to fire, let's say, X number of shots in X number of time, or I want to start to pick up the pace. My pace, of course, then is only dictated by how much effort can I apply to the trigger and keep the sights from moving if I'm not thinking about, or I'm not cognizant of, the amount of support hand pressure or grip pressures that I'm exerting on the gun. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of hold the muzzle here, right? So you can kind of see just down through the top of the gun, and I'm going to grip the support hand, right, with just a kind of a less than stellar, just kind of, again, kind of along for the ride, and I'm going to start snapping through the trigger a little bit faster and faster and faster and faster. And as you can see, the muzzle or the front sight really starts to move when I start to exert, right, an accelerated press or accelerated pressure against that trigger. So in order to combat that, what do I need to do? Well, a lot of guys are like, well, you need to adjust your trigger finger placement. You need to do this, you need to do that, so that you're exerting pressure differently on the trigger to press it straight back. And I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. But trigger finger placement and its relationship to how the gun fires is almost negated more by the fact that I need to really exert more pressure on the gun, right, with my support hand especially, in order to hold the sight still. So like my shooting process is only 2 steps, right? My 2-step shooting process is, when I draw the gun, is to establish what my grip position is going to be on the gun, most importantly, of course, then to grip the gun with enough pressure exerted on the gun so that when I start to accelerate the pressures faster and faster and faster, I get less steerage or less influence to the sights to keep the gun as still as possible, right? So my first job is to grip the gun. My second job, and most important job, is to hold the sights as still as possible while exerting whatever level of pressure is needed to make the gun fire, right? So like a 7-yard, or like in this instance, a 5-yard target behind me here, I probably don't need to exert like a very fine or fragile amount of pressure to the trigger to make the gun go off, right? I get an entire 6x11, 6x12 A zone to work with. But what if it were, let's say, a more concentrated, say 25-yard headshot, right? Or even in this case, let's say a 2-inch by 4-inch upper A zone, right? Obviously, I'm going to have to either exert a little bit different pressure on the gun as far as trigger, which means I'm going to have to slow the trigger speed down in order to hold the sight still, or I can, my primary goal, of course, is to grip the gun to add or apply as much leverage to the gun as possible to hold the sights still, so that I can then start working the trigger again. If I'm gripping the gun with my support hand with good pressures on the gun, as I press the trigger, I'm getting less movement than I would if I relax that hand and I really started seeing, obviously, the sights move. So I can press the trigger faster, or I can accelerate the press and press the trigger sooner and not have to worry about the sights moving as much. So again, trigger control then becomes secondary to my overall goal, which my overall task or priority, which is to hold the sights as still as I can. So to kind of help demonstrate this, I'm going to load, I've got 10 rounds in the gun here. I'm going to start from that double action press, and I'm going to fire one shot, or actually I'm going to fire a couple of double action pulls with a less than stellar grip pressure on the gun, and we're going to kind of see where those shots go. What I'm going to be aiming for is this center A zone, letter A, right? So that's about 3/4 of an inch wide by 3/4 of an inch tall, and we're going to see what happens when I really try to accelerate the trigger press and I'm gripping the gun with my support hand pressures, like I said, kind of less than exemplary on the gun. We're going to see what happens here. There we go. There's one. Now I'm going to try to just repeat that exact same thing again. Oh, we see what happened there? I ended up with a very, very low right shot. Low right. I'm left-handed. So if we swap that, if I were a right-handed shooter, that low left that a lot of people get isn't necessarily caused by a lack of trigger control. More so, it's caused by a lack of grip pressures to stabilize the sights while I'm accelerating the press or while I'm pressing the trigger with whatever pressure is needed. So now I'm going to do this again, only this time I'm going to grip the gun with a solidified, like what I feel like is my exemplary grip on the gun with my support hand to hold the sights still as I can. And I'm going to press and accelerate that trigger again. Here we go. Right on top. There we go. And I'm accelerating the hell out of that trigger again in order, right? I'm trying to slap through it as fast as I possibly can in order to make that gun fire as quickly as I can. So let me get a close-up there on these shots. First shot I placed, right, was pretty good. Not too bad, and this was with my less than stellar support hand grip pressure. But then as soon as I went back to double action again, that next shot, I jerked the heck out of that trigger, right? Just tried to accelerate the same level of trigger, but I ended up with a very less than stellar shot. I ended up with a really low right. Probably about right at 4 inches low right. So if I were a right-handed shooter, I would expect that low left shot. This is where that low left ends up coming from. It's not necessarily about, well, your finger needed to be on the gun a little bit differently or the trigger needed to be pressed a little bit differently. I'm pressing the trigger with the exact same level of exertion, one way or the other. The only difference I made was these were my first 2 shots. These were my next 3 shots. And those next 3 shots were right here in this exact same area, which is exactly where I was holding that level of aim. And I was like hammering through the trigger again the exact same way. I didn't change the level of pressure that I was applying to the trigger. Only thing I changed was the level of pressure that I was exerting on the pistol to hold the sights as still as I could. So like I said, I advocate that grip pressure is entirely the most important thing that I can do to the gun to be able to shoot accurately. My level of grip pressure that I apply to the gun doesn't change whether I'm shooting a 50-yard target, like shooting a 50-yard standards, or whether I'm shooting a 3-yard or 5-yard, in this case, open target. The only thing that changes, of course, then, right, is am I changing how I'm accelerating the press through the trigger? Absolutely. So like a hard, let's say 50-yard A zone, I wanted to hit a target at 50 yards A zone. I'm doing so, obviously slowing down my trigger press a little bit, but most importantly, right, like the trigger press is secondary to what my primary goal is, which is to hold the sights as still as I possibly can through that press of the trigger. At 3 yards or 5 yards or even 7 yards or 10 yards, I'm accelerating the hell out of that trigger to make the gun fire as quickly as I possibly can. My job, again, of course, is to hold the sights as still as I can with proper levels of pressure on the gun. I'm not worried about trigger finger placement. I'm not worried about how deep or how shallow the trigger is or how well the trigger is pressed straight back. My only job, my only priority is to hold the sights as still as I possibly can through whatever means that it takes to press the trigger and make the gun fire. So anyway, I know it's a little long-winded, but I'm hoping this kind of helps solve a little bit of the mystery on what it takes to shoot the gun accurately when we're firing quickly. So until next time, I'll talk to you soon.